Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support this Rebel transmission. Become a paid subscriber on Substack, $5 a month, $50 a year. You can also buy me a coffee or send reinforcement through DonorBox. We are joined by returning guest, Nick Corbishley, who's a writer, journalist, teacher, translator covering global financial, economic, and political developments. A few years ago, in the midst of the totalitarian biosecurity state, we discussed his fantastic book, Scanned: Why Vaccine Passports Will Mean the End of Privacy and Personal Freedom. Welcome back to the podcast, Nick.
Thank you, Havoye. It's lovely to be back. I hope I pronounced your name more or less right.
Yeah, you got it. And so you're doing great work. I read a lot of your stuff at places like Naked Capitalism. What have you been up to as of late? It seems you've been tackling one of my favorite topics, the issue of the algorithm ghetto, the digital gulag, and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I was staggered to realize about a week ago now, or maybe just over a week ago, that digital identity is now a legal reality in the European Union, which came as a surprise to me, bearing in mind there's not been a single bit of conversation in the public, in the 27 member nations of the European Union. There's not been a single, it's not been covered by, as far as I'm aware, a single mainstream media outlet. It's just now a reality, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it, because if you are the European Commission and you have spent years alongside your private, the private companies you're working with, you've spent years developing this system, and your goal is to reach critical mass as quickly as possible, you would think that they would be trying to publicize the fact that the European Union now has a legal framework which essentially it obligates all 27 member state governments to provide digital identity wallets to all of their citizens who want one. This is how it's couched. It's purely voluntary. It's purely optional. Is only there for those who want to make use of its wonderful benefits. And the weird thing is this wall of silence. And like I've been saying throughout the last 2 to 3 years, including in my book Scanned, that there's no way that these things could take place if there was a genuine, open debate in these supposedly, ostensibly democratic nations. If there was a genuine, if there was genuine coverage of the pros and the cons, the potential advantages and pitfalls, if that was the case, then we would not have digital identity in the European Union today. But the fact of the matter is, much like the vaccine passports, it's kind of like passed into existence through covert stealth means. The European Parliament, I think it was in late February, the European Parliament passed the regulations with a massive majority, which doesn't surprise me at all. They're all in this lovely little Brussels bubble where they're very happy and they're all living off this wonderful, massive teeth of political. It's just the perfect bubble to be living in. And then like a month later, in late March, the European Council of Ministers, which is kind of the most powerful, alongside the Commission, the most powerful arm of the European Union, they passed it, they gave their blessing to it, and now, I think it was probably about 5 or 6 days ago, it became law. So it is now, this is now something that we have to live with in the European Union. We have to see how this will develop. But the interesting thing, this is why I wrote this story a week ago, is that while the European Commission insists that this will be completely voluntary, that there will be no degree, that people will not suffer exclusion or discrimination if they do not have the digital identity on their mobile phones, the Greek government just about 10 days ago said, we will use the digital identity to essentially exclude anybody who doesn't have one from being able to enter any sports stadium in the country. And I mean, like, it's interesting. I would like to read it to you because it really is quite interesting what they say.
And while you look for that, I just wanted to comment that it's you know, what happens to people like myself, where I often like to leave the house without my smartphone, and you know, what if you go watch a game without your smartphone? You can't enter. It's absolute. That's absolute insanity. And I did want to read just from your conclusion, which I think was so important. And this is exactly how I feel. And you put it in your article. You said digital identity programs and central bank digital currencies are among the most important questions today's societies could possibly grapple with, since they threaten to transform our lives beyond recognition, granting governments and their corporate partners much more granular control over our lives. Given what is at stake, they should be under discussion in every parliament of every land and every dinner table in every country in the world. The fact they aren't speaks volumes about whose interests they're meant to serve. And that's why I've been saying for the past like 4 years now, 5, that my top topics on this podcast is this the algorithm ghetto, along with a few others. But go ahead and continue.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, like, this is a message that I first made in my book, and I repeat it in more or less any article that I write about digital identity, central bank digital currencies. There is no way that these would come into existence if there were a genuine debate and if there were genuine awareness among the public about what they entail. And I think that we have, you know, the fact that somewhere like China is, you know, much further along the path tells you everything you need to know. China doesn't need to ask any of its citizens whether or not they want certain new systems of control. This is just, it is imposed on them. And the only way democracies can carry this out is through kind of, through these kind of covert means, through pushing these kind of systems into existence without any form of public consent. And this is what we're talking about ultimately. We're talking about the consent of the governed. We're talking about a new form of social contract, in which essentially the social part of the political element, the society, has zero influence over, or has ever decreasing levels of influence over their own lives. And I would hope that with conversations like this, we will actually be able to get people to take this. And I think because there's no conversation at the political level, there's no conversation in the parliaments, there's no debate, this needs to take place at the dinner table. This needs to take place at the pub. This needs to take place in, you know, whatever social fora that we end up being in. We need to take this subject. We need to almost like impose this topic on people who don't want to hear about it, because it's the only way we have of stopping it. There needs to be, you know, an extremely broad conversation about this. Anyway, as I was saying, so going back to the wonderful government of Greek has said. So we are returning to the pictures digitally and safely. I mean, this was the announcement on the government's ticketing website. And I love the use of the word safely, as if there's no way to go to a sports stadium safely unless you've got a particular application in your smartphone. From April the 9th, 2024, the gov.gr wallet, the digital wallet we have on our mobile phone, will be the necessary, and this is in inverted commas, tool for every sports fan who wants to follow his favorite team. The way fans enter stadiums throughout the country will be now done through the gov.gr wallet. Based on the joint ministerial decision of the Deputy Minister of Sports Yanis Vroutsis, and the Minister of Digital Governance, Dimitris Papastergiou, I've mangled the pronunciation there, the new way of entering the stadiums with the gov.gr wallets ticket will come into effect from April 9, 2024. However, at the request of sports associations and clubs, in order to be properly prepared and to give the necessary adaptation time to the fans, it will be possible to enter the stadiums both in the way that was done prior to April 9th, as well as with the ticket in gov.gr wallet until the end of the current season. So, the important point to make here is that this policy directly contradicts the Commission's repeated assurances that the digital identity wallet is purely optional and that EU citizens will not face discrimination for not using one. It's really important to make this clarification. But this is also what we saw with the vaccine passport that was launched in 2021. The Green Pass legislation stipulated that the issuance of certificates should not lead to differential treatment and discrimination based on vaccination status or the possession of a specific certificate. Yet within months of its launch, it was being used by member states to ban people from traveling, accessing many public spaces, and in some cases, even from being able to work. In Austria, the government locked down around 2 million people for not being vaccinated at a time when it was already clear that the vaccines were exceedingly leaky, to put it kindly. So, yeah, we're in this situation now, as I say, kind of like sarcastically in the article. I would expect the European Commission to be having very stern words with the Greek government, saying you can't do this because you are excluding and you are discriminating against people who don't have this digital identity wallet on their mobile phones. But this is the way it's going to work. So on the one hand, you have the European Commission saying we will not discriminate. We will not exclude. This is completely optional. This is completely democratic. We're lovely people. And on the other hand, it will be down to each national government to begin the whole process of launching it in exclusionary and discriminatory ways, because it's the only way they can actually get this to become kind of become a widespread tool, as the word they use.
Yeah, and I've only seen a few people bring up the fact that these things that you're talking about, like whether it's the digital passports or now this exclusionary digital ID, case in point Greece, that it actually directly contradicts these wonderful, amazing, the EU, the European articles. You can read like the EU Charter and these articles of freedom and liberty, and you have the right to travel, and your right of movement can never be restricted. Meanwhile, it's like 2 + 2 = 5. The right hand is doing the opposite of what the left hand says, and it's like this technocracy where the EU's charter says you're supposed to be allowed this freedom. Meanwhile, they're actively outsourcing, your freedom to private companies. And I think in this sort of system, you'd have no recourse. If you're a Greek and you can't enter the stadium because you don't have a smartphone or you don't want one, there's who are you going to complain to? I think that's the nature of this technocratic system, and where you've got no one to complain to. Did you feel that's kind of the way they want it to go? Where it's like this Brazil, the movie Brazil, the dystopia, where you've gotten really no recourse.
Yeah, I think that it's a very important point you make. So the European Union is able to push these kinds of systems because there is this huge disconnect between what happens at the national level and what exists at the supranational level, what happens in Brussels and what happens in each country's capital. So we saw this with the vaccine passports. They were able to get away with completely contravening the letter and spirit of the legislation they passed. Nothing happened. But even more so, what is interesting about the vaccine passport is that it kind of its expiry date was the 30th of June, 2023, after a couple of it was given an extra year. I think, in 2022. But in 2023, it came to an end. The day after that, the World Health Organization announced that it was going to use the European Union's vaccine certificate, digital vaccine certificate or digital COVID-19 certificate, as the template for its own global vaccine certificate that it's working on. So, I mean, like the really dangerous thing about the European Union is not just what happens within the European bloc, the EU bloc, it's how this ends up getting exported around the world. And we've seen this with the vaccine passport. We've seen this with the GDPR, the data protection rules on the internet. And we're going to see this almost certainly with the Digital Services Act, which came into effect, like fully into effect earlier this year, which is essentially a global model of censorship, internet censorship, that is going to, and is almost certainly already having an impact far beyond European borders. So, I mean, the example, Elon Musk, there's a very good commentator on Twitter, and I think he's on Daily Skeptic sometimes, called Robert Kogon, and he highlights the hypocrisy of Elon Musk whenever he's talking about, the fight for freedom of speech in the United States. And like, he will always be focused on what is happening in the United States, because he knows that he's got on his side, he's got all of, he's got the First Amendment, he's got all these legislative elements, all these constitutional laws that are going to make it much more harder for the US to go down the path that the EU is. But at the same time, he's doing nothing. So he is almost certainly following every kind of like instruction from the European Union through his Digital Services Act, and there's complete silence from him on that. So yes, it's kind of like this contradiction. He said he has said before that he will do whatever, he will abide by whatever free speech laws exist in each jurisdiction. So, I mean, this is where the European Union is a genuine threat, not only in Europe, but around the world, because of this ability it has as a regulatory superpower to set the norms at a global level.
And this is why I've been saying this for 2 decades now. I'm an EU citizen as well, and the EU, in my mind, having studied it, it's a fascist, collectivist, totalitarian, even communist-like construct. Dr. Rath talks about the Nazi roots of Brussels. Soviet dissidents like Bukovsky have called it the new European Soviet. It's been a globalist project, and it's been the blueprint for world government. It's the EU is the blueprint for technocratic, supranational, globalist world government. So they're exporting everything, as you say. They're working on these different forms of tyranny in Brussels, and then they want to export the entire Brussels model, the EU model. Russia's replicating it, the Eurasian Union. You're going to have 2 EUs. I don't know how they're going to figure that out with the name, but North American Union, South American Union. The Bukele is talking about Central American Union. So there's that, and then all of these things that you're talking about, exporting the digital ID, the GDPR, all this sort of stuff, and you see the EU government, supranational government, is consulting with countries throughout Latin America and other countries to help them bring about the same thing. You got ECOWAS, I think, in Africa. The EU is sort of helping Africa regionalize and create like a common regional currency and all that sort of stuff.
I mean the vaccine passport in Africa that they're supposedly working on would not be possible without European Union money. European Union influence in kind of like the African Union is totally dependent on outside funds. So there's from day one, it's kind of like got zero sovereignty within this model. So the European Union is not just undemocratic; it is actively anti-democratic in its very essence, and that is how it was designed. And it's it's disturbing to watch. It's weird to see, like, when you hear people like Lula talk about the need for integration. I mean, there could be an argument. There could be an argument for example, in South America, for a trade bloc. But that's not what the European Union is. The European Union started as a trade bloc. And it has morphed into this absolute monster that is essentially destroying democracy in the home of democracy. But the weird thing is like the way how it is able to do this. And I would argue the way it's able to do this is for the simple fact that there is so great a distance between Brussels, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the rest of Europe, the people they're supposed to, whose interests they're supposed to serve. So, I mean, there was a really interesting poll done about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think it was by Euronews, and they were asking different countries where what they thought of the European Commission's kind of like performance over the last 6 years, because it's coming to an end. And in many countries, the overwhelming answer was, I don't know. I mean, like, rather than positive or negative, in quite a few countries, like, you have 30-40% of the people saying, I cannot answer that question. And that's how you kill democracy, by essentially hollowing it out so it means nothing. And that is what they've done expertly, incredibly well in the UK. That's not to say, I mean, like, the UK with Brexit and everything, the UK is on the same path.
Yeah, and so, I don't see anyone who's not on this path. No. And I was just thinking, if you think about it, if you extrapolate, I don't think you cannot have democracy supranationally. Democracy, I think, has to be limited to a certain geography, more local government. But once you get beyond too big, it cannot exist. You cannot have.
This is what a lot of the old school Labour MPs used to think, like in the 1970s when the UK was going through the process of joining the European Union. Back in those days, kind of like the left wing were actually more hostile to the European Union because, and a lot of them said exactly this point, how can you have a democracy when you don't have a demos, when you don't have a people? And we're seeing that, exactly, that they were exactly right. You can't have a democracy without a people. You can have all the kind of like the outward, what's
trappings.
The word? The outward trappings of democracy. But just like they had in the Soviet Union, you can have plenty of chambers, you can have plenty of places where they discuss things. But if you say the wrong thing, you can end up in a gulag. In our case here, we're talking about digital gulags. We are talking about excluding people from the most basic elements of life because either they are not willing to go along with the technological path, or because once they are on this technological path, they begin to say things or do things that will attract some form of punishment. And that is, I mean, like, there was a really good, I mean, I would like to quote this. This is from the World Economic Forum. So in 2018, the World Economic Forum dedicated its meeting in Davos to digital identities. So we're talking 6 years ago. And there was, they released this 130 page report, which I do not recommend anyone to read unless they're genuinely masochistic. But there is a quote from this, which is really important because it sums up what this is about. So in this report on digital IDs, the World Economic Forum admitted that while verifiable digital identities create new markets and business lines for companies, especially those in the tech industry that help to operate their ID systems, while no doubt vacuuming up the data, for individuals, they open up, and this part is in brackets, or close off the digital world with its jobs, political activities, education, financial services, healthcare, and more. And I say it is the part in brackets, the closing off of the digital and, to a large extent, the analog realm that should trouble us all. Because it's not just about closing off your ability to do things online. It's about closing off your ability to do things, as we see in Greece, your ability to go to a stadium, So, I mean, like, it's closing off so many aspects of your life, whether that is related to your health, whether it's related to your financial services, whether it's related to travel, whether it's related to e-commerce, your ability to use certain social media, etc., etc. I mean, like, it's the breadth of its impact is almost boundless.
And as you mentioned earlier, there's no demos, but there is a technos. And so if there's no democracy, it's a technocracy. And I read your articles, Naked Capitalism. I follow biometricupdate.com, which I think is a very useful tool. And it's just, you're seeing every country, every day they're reporting, people can go on the Geopolitics and Empire Telegram feed and just type in the search, and I've got everything archived, all these articles going back years. I'm reading the latest. Costa Rica sets out to launch digital IDs by the end of 2025. The other day, Sierra Leone, digital ID has been instrumental in the country's ongoing digital government efforts, as almost all government services have been digitized and linked to the digital ID. And then what you just mentioned can be applied. All services have been linked, so you can be closed off and if you don't, as you mentioned as well, if you're ideologically not in line with what the government says, they can shut you off. And that, from the analog world as well, as you mentioned, you won't be able to drive a car. They can just shut off your driver's license, deny you renewing it, or your passport for travel. Work requirements, you won't be able to work, like we saw what happened a couple of years ago. So no work, no driving car, no flying on a plane, no entering supermarket. The list will just keep getting longer. No entering the stadium. And it's just how far do you think they can take us down this path? And anything you want to mention about CBDCs as well, because I think all these things tie in.
Yes. I mean, how far they're able to take us down this path will depend entirely on how much of pushback they get. If they're able, I mean, like, one of the things that struck me about the kind of vaccine passport period and in Europe was how people always have a price. There's always a price. There's always a way that you can get somebody to do something. Whether it's to work. And I can understand, for example, in the United States, why people eventually decide, okay, I'm going to get vaccinated, even though I don't want to get the vaccine, because I'm going to lose my job otherwise. Because if you lose your job, then, you can no longer pay your mortgage. And, you're talking about an unraveling of your life. But I mean, like, what staggered me was the number of people who actually said, I got my vaccine in order to be able to travel, to go on holiday. It's like, really? Your holiday was worth that much? And I know people who actually got their children vaccinated so they could take them on holiday with them. So I mean, like, everybody has a price. I think that's kind of like the concerning thing about this is, as we've seen with this step in Greece, is like, okay, we're going to just tell people that you need to use it for the stadium. How many people can say, okay, I'm going to stop watching my football team that I've been watching for the last 30 years every Saturday, religiously every Saturday or every other Saturday. I'm going to stop doing that because I don't want to get this digital identity. And then probably you'll find that it's an interesting, I don't say this in this article, but maybe they chose sport venues because maybe sport people are not so politically interested, so politically engaged. They just want to watch a ball being kicked around or being hit around for an hour and a half or whatever. So I mean, like, you can kind of understand, and something else, talking about a cashless thing, a lot of sports stadiums are also at the forefront of the kind of cashless move. So many stadiums now kind of like no longer accepting cash. So it does seem that, they see that sport is an opportunity to kind of like to push this agenda. The Olympics in Paris, I don't know if you're aware about what the plans are for. I mean, this is a crazy story that is kind of like getting quite a lot of coverage in France, but it's not getting much coverage outside of France. So I mean, basically, they're bringing back the QR code that they used for the vaccine passport to control a part of central Paris for, I don't think it's the entirety of the Olympics. It's not for the whole month, but it's as far as what I've read is that it's for at least 8 days. If you live in this particular area, and I think there's something like 20,000 residents, you need to download this QR code on your mobile phone in order to be able to access your own neighborhood.
No, I in some ways, I wish I could experience that, because I would leave my house without a phone, and I'd be like, I would flip out. I would be like, I'm sleeping on the street. I'll sleep right in front of the police, right there on your feet. Like, you cannot force me to carry around this matrix, device. How do you? I could continue, but I just can't imagine this.
It's unbelievable. I mean, like, this is happening in central Paris. And it's like the Olympics is supposed to be kind of like a festive, it's something to celebrate, something to bring people together. And you've got army checkpoints, basically excluding people from getting, and they actually say they have the balls, as Tony Soprano would say, they have the balls to say, we are not stopping people from crossing Paris. No, because you can get under this area on Metro, but you can't go overland without the QR code. And obviously using, excuses like terrorism, the risk of terrorism. But it's like, well, hang on, in 2012, the risk of terrorism in London was it had a terrorist attack 5 years earlier, and yet you did not have QR codes, you did not have army checkpoints. So I mean, like, this is how, and the use of things like sport events to push this agenda, it's an incredible thing. So yeah, I would definitely urge people to read into this, because it really is. It's like creating hell on earth in order to have Olympics for 4 weeks. You are creating this. It kind of reminds me of like when the G20 started becoming a curse to every city. The meeting was held in. They would have to kind of like bring half the city to a standstill in order to allow all these. And that is the state of democracy today. We need to separate the rulers from the ruled, because there is so much distance between them, and because there is so much contempt among the population for their rulers. So yes, it's a continuation of a long standing trend.
Yeah, I mean, it's total. I mean, it's oligarchy. I remember 2009 when I was in Geneva. NATO was coming to some suburb in Germany, and a whole bunch of us were going to go and protest. And they did the same thing you just outlined. They shut no one in or out from the town, because it's democracy, right? You can't protest, you can't air your complaints about the ultra democratic rainbows and unicorns and roses, NATO, the amazing NATO, right? And so whether it's G20 or NATO or Brussels, I mean, these are all, in my mind, the nodes of this global oligarchy. And something that actually irritated me, I had a recent experience where, just maybe your thoughts on the brainwashing, where I agree there's a certain part of the population that recognizes all of this for what it is, and then there's others that are doubled down in Stockholm syndrome. I met a student of mine recently at a gathering. Was my student maybe 10 years ago, taught at the high school here, and we could not agree on anything. The student believes every single official narrative on everything. Climate, COVID, the government is the sole source of truth, which kind of reminds me of what you were saying. I think a lot of these terror events are manufactured, false flag operations, if you ask me. And then it's very George Orwell. George Orwell talks about that in 1984, how all these different states create this terrorism to keep us controlled, and take away our civil liberties. In Australia, you had recently this knife attack, and then now they're saying they want to use that for controlling what Australians can and cannot see. One Australian authority said, I'm exaggerating here, but basically the sole truth you can only get from us. And I'm thinking of misinformation and disinformation. That you can only, a democracy, again, going back to that, democracy can only exist with disinformation or misinformation, right? I grew up where all information must be allowed. This info doesn't exist in democracy. But once you introduce that concept where there's no free information now for free flow, you're not a democracy. This is totalitarianism. And my student actually advocated for my podcast being deplatformed. And this is that mind today of the youth who are, I call them a liberal globalist minded, and they're totalitarian right in your face. They're like, oh, you're speaking against what the official narrative is? Yeah, I think your podcast should be deplatformed. Now, I just can't, I'm just sitting there like, I cannot believe this. Your thoughts on it and on my little rant here.
I agree completely. I mean, again, it's the Digital Services Act in the European Union. There was just the amount of resistance that existed to that, whether in the media, even among NGOs. The number of NGOs that kind of like went along with a lot of it while kind of like saying, well, actually, this is a little bit disturbing. This is a little bit concerning. It's like, hang on. Your job, you're supposed to be a civil rights organization, and you're only just kind of like, flagging up this as a possible concern. This is the end of democracy. This is the end of you cannot have a democratic, liberal government or a liberal democracy without kind of like freedom of speech at the foundation level. And this is something that, if you go back 200, 300 years, the political philosophers were very, very clear about. Without freedom of speech, you don't have, all the other freedoms are meaningless. And unfortunately, I think that a large number of people in the younger generations are not aware of this, or they don't seem to care. It's a bizarre thing. There's a tendency to kind of like see that they've been able to use emotional issues very, very, very cleverly to engender certain reactions. And whether that's, for example, something like the trans movement, these kinds of things, they're very good at dividing people, but they're also very good at kind of like enforcing ways of thinking. So the moment you can enforce ways of thinking about smaller issues, you can enforce ways of thinking about much more important, much bigger issues. And this is what I think we're seeing. So, I mean, like my site, Naked Capitalism, had a threat about that it was going to be demonetized because of certain number of articles that Google didn't like. And it was like, and when you look at the articles, I mean, like the weird thing is like, it seems like they had selected the weirdest choice of articles. They could have selected articles that were much more offensive to the likes of Google, but they chose these like 13 articles, and most of the justifications were completely unfounded. You've got Unheard in the UK that has had something similar, where it's kind of like being excluded from being able to attract certain advertisers because of its position on the transgender question. And it's kind of like, this is the new norm. And if there isn't the kind of pushback that's necessary, the weird thing for me is that how people cannot put two and two together and realize, hang on, our government is constantly lying to us. They are the main source of disinformation and misinformation. So, I mean, like if you go to the European Union level, Ursula von der Leyen, who's basically facing criminal investigation over the Pfizergate scandal, and a whole host of other scandals. Do you think that she and the organization she heads is a good referee or this determinant of who is speaking the right thing? I mean, it's an incredible amount of power to give to an organization. The conflicts are just huge. The conflicts of interest. You're giving the European Commission the power to decide what is acceptable information at the same time that it has political interests. And whatever information is threatening to those political interests, it can very much easily determine mis or disinformation. Even the use of malinformation. You've got people actually coming out and saying, well, it's not just disinformation, misinformation, it's dangerous information that may be true, but is dangerous. And it's like, it terrifies me that there isn't a pushback that there absolutely should be. But like I said, there's that disconnect, the distance between the European Commission and the governed, the people it governs, is just so huge. And, I reckon if you ask 100 EU citizens who is the president of the European Commission, I'd be intrigued to know how many people would be able to identify von der Leyen.
Yeah, last night I like to call her Frau Ursula Gertrud von der Leyen. Her second name is Gertrude. And I last night I just watched Freddie.
It's not yet.
Huh?
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, last night I watched Freddie Sayers of Unheard explain what you just mentioned. I think the Global Disinformation Index, how they're being attacked again by this system, but and as well the other story the other day that the EU wants to pass the law where they will have access to all of your messaging, Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp, email. They can read your emails, your love letters to your spouse, whatever, your personal medical issues. And they just put a clause where that you won't be able to do it to the those working in the government. It's like total totalitarianism. And I'm just thinking back to my conversation with my student. It's like I mentioned I have this podcast. I've spoken to hundreds of experts, and they dismiss. It's like I can't understand this psychology of someone who just so readily accepts like the government is always telling the truth. I'm like, what planet do you live on? Like, you literally cannot have a conversation with someone who's that far gone. Anyways, I want to get your thoughts before we run out of time on geopolitics. You've written about geopolitics in Argentina recently. The whole BRICS multipolar world is going to save us, right? Nick, I saw Dugin. Someone shared where Alexander Dugin recently said that Orwell is the West, not the East. I respect in certain ways Dugin, but I'm sorry. No, there were no lockdowns or QR codes or vax passports in Russia or Kazakhstan where I lived or China, right? No, none of that existed. And something interesting, Sergei Glaziev recently just posted, he said, a new global settlement digital currency is coming, getting ready for implementation. And the website is unitfoundation.org. People can go there, and it's just they're talking about linking it to gold. But in any case, I just kind of see when it comes to the technocracy, the East is. You're saying that they're even more advanced in implementing this totalitarian sort of technocracy. Your further thoughts on the multipolar world as well as geopolitics in Latin America or whatnot?
Okay. So my initial thought on the multipolar world would be that I think that is a nice idea. It's a nice idea to have a world which is, if you have a choice between a multipolar or a unipolar world, I would take a multipolar world, even more so than a bipolar world. It's a nice idea. And let's be fair, let's be honest, it's about time that the West began sharing some of its spoils. So yeah, I like the idea. What concerns me, like you said, is that these are governments that are not, on the whole, liberal democracies when it comes to the BRICS. If you're looking at the BRICS countries, with the exception to a certain extent of Brazil, South Africa, you're talking about India, Russia, and I think China. Certainly, China is a totalitarian technocratic system. They are much further along the road towards killing cash and launching central bank digital currencies than almost all the Western economies. And the reason for this is because they can get away with it. It's easier, and I mean, even in the case, so let's look at the case of Brazil. Brazil is an interesting case in point. I was shocked to learn a year ago that Brazil is something like, I think something like just like 10% or just above 10% of all transactions are now in cash. And a huge number of the transactions are now taking place with an instant payment system called Pix. And Pix is a system that was developed by the central bank and commercial banks in order to create kind of like this peer-to-peer payment system. But it's not just peer-to-peer. You can use it's on your mobile phone. You can use it to pay businesses. You can use it even to pay the government. So I mean, like, it's an incredibly convenient, it's an incredibly efficient system. And within the Brazilian government, you know, you're hearing calls now to basically pull the plug on cash. And this is something that's unthinkable in a country like Mexico, where we are right now, because Mexico is still a cash-dependent economy. It would be unthinkable in my country of residence, Spain, because of just how much cash is used. Germany, even in the UK, it's impossible to imagine the government or members of the government openly calling for the death of cash. And this is an economy where 15% of transactions are done by cash. So China is arguably the most cashless economy on the planet. China has the most advanced central bank digital currency. It has been working on the digital yuan for the last 10 years. So this is the way China does things. China does things very slowly in a kind of piecemeal fashion, making sure that everything is in place. It's very different to kind of like the way many European governments do things. And China now has, I think, 250 million people with the kind of digital yuan app on their phone across 25 different cities. So it's much further along. In China, it would be much easier to launch the digital yuan or their CBDC than just about any other economy, because most people use the Alipay or WeChat Pay applications to make payments. People are used to using the QR code, a QR code payment app on their phones to pay for everything. So making that jump from Alipay to the digital yuan, that's the hard thing that the Chinese government has to come up with. So yeah, I think that Russia is pushing ahead with digital identity. It's got pilot systems for its digital ruble. The Indian government is carrying out pilot programs for its digital rupee. It's now expanding that. So I mean, yeah, we are. You know, if you're looking at the BRICS as some kind of salvation, you are looking in the wrong place. I think that is the important message. I like the idea of the multipolar world. I like the idea of. I mean, I think what Milei has done in Argentina is absolute insanity. I think people will be studying this for centuries into the future, if there is a future lasting centuries, if we don't destroy ourselves in the short term, then yeah, I think that we are looking at one of the craziest governments. I mean, Argentina has come up with some pretty crazy governments in its history, and you could argue that it's one of the worst governed countries on the planet because of the potential of its economy and because of the reality, the difference between the potential of its economy and the reality of its economy. This is not to say that Milei is solely responsible for the state of the Argentine economy right now, which has the highest level of inflation, although that is coming down. But he is creating 1 million poor people a month in a country with a population, if I'm not mistaken, around about 40 million. So, I mean, it's one of these examples where the medicine is far worse than the disease. What staggers me is how a nation like Argentina, one of the most educated nations in Latin America, it's not the most educated nation, maybe that's the reason, how they voted for somebody who is so blatantly a fraud, a man who claims to be, and this is what I find really frustrating about Milei, is he is kind of celebrated by libertarians or people who claim to be kind of liberal minded in places like the US, places like Europe, across Latin America. If you scratch the surface, this guy has very little of what you would describe as liberty about him. This is a man who hasn't thought about legalizing drugs. So that would be the number one thing. If you're a libertarian, number one, you start the process of legalizing drugs. This was something that he talked about positively when he was just a pundit, a television pundit. But when he became a politician, his whole message changed. You would also expect a libertarian to be absolutely against monopoly. Yet Milei is somebody who worked for more than 10 years for one of Argentina's biggest monopolists, a guy called Eduardo Urnegano. I can't remember the exact name, but he's basically, his company owns 35 of Argentina's airports. So I mean, almost all of Argentina's airports are owned by one person. And Milei worked for this guy. Milei, one of the first things he did as president was to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos. And you cannot find a more anti-liberty, pro-technocratic, pro-globalist organization on the planet. And there, he went there to give a lecture about the beauties of the capitalist model that he has in mind. He wants to essentially sell out, or he talks about selling out Argentine sovereignty by taking on the dollar, like getting rid of its own currency. And he's now in the process of literally handing over the United States to Argentina to the United States Army and to Israel. So I mean, I find it just this disconnect between the level of discourse about this man beyond Argentina, as if he was some kind of hero, when he's essentially selling out his country. I think he's a traitor. He has given the United States Army Army Engineering Corps essentially the right to operate along the whole stretch of the Paraná River and large parts of the Rio de Plata. And this is like where 80% of Argentina's exports travel down this route. It is a fundamentally important part of the South American economy. It has important geostrategic implications. Paraguay has done the same. The government of Paraguay also did the same. So eventually, you have the U.S. Army, this US South Command, essentially controlling or having the ability to control, to operate along the course of the second longest river in Latin America. And it's like, people, celebrate this guy as if he's a hero. He just set up a U.S. military base in Tierra del Fuego, which is kind of like, it's the last stop on the way to the Antarctic. And he says he actually said in an interview, this is the greatest act of sovereignty that anybody has done in the last 40 years, because we are going to strengthen our claims, our territorial claims over the Antarctic. What he's doing is strengthening US geopolitical, geostrategic position vis-a-vis the Antarctic, because the Antarctic is going to be a very important place in the coming future for a host of reasons. Number one, the fact that it is the largest source of fresh water on the planet.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, I shared this story on my feed. Argentina formally requests to join NATO as a global partner. I rewrote that headline. NATO, the one world army, continues its advance because it's clear now. And Thomas Fazzi of On the Herd recently wrote a separate piece on a topic that I've been focusing on for years a lot as well, which I think is important. I think NATO, people don't understand how important NATO is into the grand scheme of things, because if you're going to have a world government, a world federation, which is the whole UN, EU, World Economic Forum apparatus, backed by, you mentioned in your recent article as well, the World Bank is overseeing all countries install digital ID. So you've got that world government system. You need a one world army. That's been written about for years, and all these globalists in their own white papers. It's just logical. If you have a national government, you have a national economic system, national currency, national culture, national military structure. It's the same for supranational. And so what is NATO doing? I think Colombia is the first global partner. Now they want Argentina. It makes no sense at all to do what they're doing unless you understand its end goal is to become, there's only going to be one army in the world, and it's going to be NATO. And then in Asia, now they're pushing. I just read recently this General Stavridis, I think was his name, saying we should. Your mind is blown. Thailand and like Indonesia or Singapore, these countries should be incorporated into NATO. It's like that doesn't make any sense unless you understand the real deceptive reason is to make NATO the world government, and they have to eliminate Russia, China, any potential threats to this world structure. So they either have to get BRICS, China, Russia, on board with this system, or start a World War III to make sure they can never resist. Because I think we're reaching a point where like they're gonna the capstone. They're ready almost to install the capstone on this global system. So, any further thoughts on that? Or
I think you're. It reminds me of Orwell's 1984. We keep mentioning Orwell's 1984, but the fact of the matter is that the incredible part of that story is that in the end, the war wasn't real. You had these blocks that were fighting, supposedly in this kind of like global conflict, this global war, when really what their interests were controlling the populace. If you're looking at NATO, I'm not sure about global army, but clearly NATO is being used to kind of like to try to push back against China in the Asia Pacific region, which is why countries like, they're talking about a country like Thailand or Indonesia, et cetera, something similar appears to be happening in South America. So Colombia was an obvious candidate for a global partner, a NATO global partner, 7 years ago when it became a global partner, because it was the government at that time was Ivan Duque, I think, and he was absolutely on board with everything Western, just like Milei is right now. The interesting thing is to what extent they want to kind of like, and I imagine Ecuador will be a perfect candidate as well with its rich boy banana king ruler right now. But to what extent they want to kind of just like get countries in South America that will allow them to cause major problems for Brazil, and beyond that, Venezuela, Bolivia, and these kinds of countries. The US has military bases, not just in Argentina and Colombia. It has US bases in Panama. It has US bases, I believe, in Chile. It has US bases. So, it already has in Paraguay. So if you look at the map, it's kind of like, those maps where you see like the American flags around Russia. And you'd see it's a similar thing around Brazil and around Bolivia. But it's insane to think that the Argentinians, I think that during the election period, the Argentinians were so focused on the economy, and they were so kind of like believing in the unicorns and the rainbows that Milei was promising them. And I think that the fact that Argentina won the World Cup in 2022 played a part in this. it's my theory, it's only a theory, but I think like this gave the country this kind of sense of, not quite invincibility, but things are going to get better. So when you have this snake oil salesman come around and he promises them the world, and they believed him, but he was very clear during the campaign period that he was going to completely align himself with the US and Israel. He was not going, he was going to kind of almost disconnect Argentina from China and Brazil, which are the two main commercial partners, the two main trading partners that Argentina has, which is insane if you think about it, especially when you consider that China has been providing Argentina with kind of emergency currency swaps, which has kept the economy alive. So I mean, like it goes against any kind of notions of common sense. But most people were not focusing on the geopolitics, the potential geopolitics of a Milei presidency. They were much more interested in the economic question, which you can understand if inflation is 120% at that time. Now I think it's about 250, 260. But yeah, I mean, NATO should not exist. It should not exist. You can argue it should never have existed, but its expiry date was essentially in the early 90s when its existential enemy, its existential foe, the Soviet Union collapsed. But it's like a zombie that just won't die. It's like Freddy Krueger. It just keeps coming back. You put a stake through its heart and it just comes back and it gets stronger. But if it doesn't get stronger, it gets bigger, which is what's happening right now.
And someone should make a horror film with zombies, with all of these EU, the Stoltenbergs and the von der Leyens and all this stuff. What then, given all that we've discussed, I'm a bit more pessimistic than some of my guests are that come on, and I listen to all views, but I kind of feel you see them pushing forward with this a lot of these digital technocracy plans, and it's fun for us to be putting spokes in their wheels, and it's not going always perfect for them, but nonetheless they continue to advance, as you mentioned, in Greece, in different ways here in Mexico, in other ways elsewhere. But any thoughts on resisting the dystopia, preparing for life in the algorithm ghetto, as I like to call it?
Location, I think, is going to be important. So in a digital kind of dictatorship, you probably don't want to be in a country which is exceptionally obedient, where the populace is generally very obedient and very trusting, etc., etc. I think the idea of something like Germany, Austria, we already saw that during the pandemic. France even was not a good place to be. I think that Mexico, I've spent 5 of the last 12 months in Mexico. I think that, Mexico is an interesting place because it is one of the more anarchical countries you can be in. People do not have the same regard or respect for authority that you would certainly find in many European countries. So you have, I think, more that it's going to be much harder for them to enforce these kinds of systems. And even once they do, there's going to be so many ways of getting around it. There are going to be so many fake digital identities in Mexico, just as there were in France with the fake vaccine passports. I hope that it doesn't come to that. I like the idea that there is a way of pushing back, but I don't see it. I remember being in a demonstration in Barcelona in 2000, and I think it was early 2022 or late 2021 when the vaccine passport was coming into effect there. And there was a demonstration against this in the center of Barcelona. There's probably about 2,000, 3,000 people. There should have been 200, 300,000, but it was 2,000, 3,000. And I remember walking along the length of it and just just to have an idea, who are these people? And most of them were kind of like our age. They were in their mid to late 40s, or even going to like 60s, 70s. What there wasn't was young people. So there were no 20-somethings. There may have been a couple of 30-somethings. And the irony is we were walking through the center of the city on a Saturday afternoon, and young people were coming out of the shops and they were seeing this demonstration. And I was just watching them kind of pull out their mobile phones and start filming it. And it made me realize, that moment made me kind of realize, Jesus, maybe we are screwed. Because I think the greatest resistance to this is going to come from older people and younger people, because they've grown up with the mobile phone. They don't know a world without the mobile phone. It is an extension of their limbs. It's just part of them. And you see, I mean, young people walk around with the mobile phone in their hand all the time because they can't kind of like even put it in the pocket. Maybe I'm offending a lot of young people. I'd like to think that a lot of your viewers, in their 20s, we said this is bullshit. This is not true. I hope that is the case, and I hope it's my jaded opinion as somebody in their late 40s. But I would love to see more movement from younger people, but I don't see that happening because their life is the mobile phone.
I see the same as you. I'm a bit jaded, and I think we're screwed. And I came to the realization, I realized recently, that a lot of the listeners to Geopolitics and Empire are older folks, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-olds, maybe some 80-year-olds. And like my interaction with my former student, they've indoctrinated the youth. They've brainwashed them through this mass apparatus of the phone, as you say, of social media, of Netflix, TV shows, films, everything, and just this repetitive propaganda. And the youth have bought into this totalitarian scientific dictatorship, and it's now this disconnect where us older folks, we're going to die out, and this new demographic of youth, they're going to have a critical mass that goes along with this algorithm ghetto. And I'm just going to retire to some mountain in rural Mexico, some cave, some.
I was going to suggest to you, why not an island in Croatia with lots of goats, just, I don't know, milking goats. I keep thinking that, I mean, like, a nice life would just be to get away somewhere and like take your books with you, and yeah, live without the mobile phone. It's going to be very difficult to live without the mobile phone in most places in the future we're talking about, because it's going to be the key to everything. And yeah, like I said, I think that a better place would be somewhere like Mexico than somewhere like the most places in the EU. But I still have a tiny, do you know what gives me a tiny little bit of hope? The incompetency of our elite. The hubris and incompetency of our elite. I think sometimes we give them too much kudos for being like these kind of almost godlike figures that are able to do whatever they want. And I mean, like, one thing that I've kind of recorded in some of my articles is the failures of the central bank digital currency systems that have gone live. They're very few. So I mean, like Jamaica, Nigeria, the Bahamas. Interestingly, former colonies of the British Empire, all of them. So I mean, I don't know if that's just a pure coincidence, but I mean, like in the case of Nigeria, the e-naira was such a disaster that they had to kind of like they had to carry out this demonetization experiment similar to what India did in 2016. They essentially pulled out, they withdrew something like 50% of all the cash in the economy without replacing it with new notes, causing total chaos, total mayhem, destroying Lord knows how many businesses, livelihoods, because for about a month there was essentially no cash in the system, or the cash was almost impossible to access. And the result of that was we had a change of government, because this all took place in the midst of elections, general elections. We had a change of government, and the new government came in. By then, the Supreme Court of Nigeria had said this was illegal. The demonetization campaign was totally illegal. The new government came in, arrested the central bank chief, Godwin Emefiele, if I'm not mistaken, is his name. They arrested him, and he spent 5 months in jail, which probably is not a nice experience in Nigeria. And this is, I think, if you try looking for central bankers in jail on Google, that's a fun thing to try and look for, because I think like the only one is this guy. And since then, and I'm not saying that this is the cause. I mean, ironically, after all of this, destroying cash, taking away cash, the central bank digital currency was still more or less dead on arrival. It was still kind of like stillbirth. The central bank governor was in jail. He faces 26 charges of fraud and misappropriation of funds and all these kinds of things. And on top of that, Nigeria's economy has gone from the biggest economy in Africa in 2022, when they launched the e-Naira, to the fourth largest economy in Africa. And I'm not saying that is the only cause of this, and there are lots of other reasons. But I'm saying, like, if you are an African central banker right now, and you're looking at what just happened, and you're saying, oh my God, Nigeria is the first largest economy in the world, to launch a central bank digital currency. Its economy has shrunk. Its inflation is off the charts. Its central bank governor is in jail, or was in jail, now faces 26 criminal counts. And maybe they're thinking, I don't want to be next. So I think that this is one thing that gives me a little bit of hope. Maybe the system's collapsed. So I mean, again, with digital identity, a German hacker recently warned the German government that their digital identity wallet, was extremely porous. And he showed how he was able to get onto people's phones. Once he was able to get onto people's phones, he was able to get into the digital identity system. And basically, the German government said, nah, whatever. This is not a problem of the digital identity system. This is a problem of the phones. So, I mean, this hacker basically said, well, hang on. I'm trying to do you a favor here. You're telling me you're not bothered. You're basically putting all the onus on the smartphone holder to protect his phone from attacks, from hacks. And like, I think that is something like the Aadhaar system in India, which is the biggest digital identity system in the world, has had so many hacks, has had so many problems. And the government just pretends that they don't exist. They continue to deny that any kind of hack has ever taken place, that any kind of security flaw. They just like say that it's perfect. So I think that the hubris and the incompetence of our overlords is maybe something that should give us a little slither of hope.
Hope is never lost, and I look forward to continuing in this battle, especially with my fellow citizen lemmings. Everywhere I go, anytime I go to a restaurant here in Mexico where they have only QR code menus, I'm like, screw! I'm not scanning that thing. Screw you! Either tell me what is on the menu, give me a physical menu, or I'm leaving. And I'm in my.
Man, we are outliers here. We are in the tiny minority. My wife is exactly the same. We have so many arguments. We go to a place and she says, bring us a menu, tráenos una carta, por favor. And they say, no, todo es, they'll show you the little QR code. My wife's like, no, what do we say? So what if I'm 80 years old? What if and they'll say, no, but this is to save the planet. This is to save the trees. This is like, it's like they'll have any old bullshit excuse. But I mean, like, the reality is you put it on a board, put it somewhere. So I mean, like, we walk out. We walk out whenever we are confronted with that. But yeah, unfortunately we are in a very small minority.
Well, it's going to be interesting times ahead. Any final thought, and then tell us again. Your book is fantastic. People can check the archive. I should include the link in the description of our past discussion. We're discussing your book, Scanned. Highly recommended. And the link to your X Twitter account is in the description. Any other websites or projects?
I mean, like, I'm writing twice a week for Naked Capitalism. I'm in negotiations with my publisher about writing a book about the war on cash and the rise of central bank digital currencies. I'm not sure if that's going to happen. It would be great if it did. And yeah, I mean, like, I'm just staying as active as I can, whether I'm here in Mexico or in Barcelona. And I hope that the word gets out. We need this conversation to get larger. And hopefully this video will help.
And hopefully one of these days we meet, our paths cross here in Mexico for a tequila and tacos. So
absolutely. I'm up for that, mate. I'm up for that. Whether here in Mexico City or in Guadalajara, on the beach, wherever. Can't wait.
I've met a number of my listeners and as well as guests. So thanks for all you're doing, Nick. Keep up the great work.
Likewise. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.